I need to read the transcript file to understand the original story structure before writing a new one. I have the full transcript. Now I'll write the new story. She said it the way people say things they've been thinking for a long time. Casual, like breathing. I had just pushed through the glass doors of the Marriott and was still adjusting my collar when I heard my son's fiancée lean toward her sister and say it, low but not low enough. Oh good, the repairman made it. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at her own reflection in the window behind my head, fixing a strand of hair that didn't need fixing. I was peripheral to her, background, an inconvenience that had unfortunately remembered to show up. I stood there in the middle of that lobby, 62 years old, in the same sport coat I'd worn to my daughter's graduation, shoes I'd spent 20 minutes that morning going over with a brush, and I felt every one of those years compressed down into about 3 seconds of pure white silence. A man nearby cleared his throat. Someone laughed at something on the other side of the room. Life continued in every direction around me while I stood there trying to figure out what to do with my hands. I was about to turn around. I want to say that plainly because it's the truth. I had already shifted my weight toward the exit. 62 years of building something from nothing, of getting up before light and coming in after dark. One sentence from a 28-year-old woman had made me feel like an embarrassment at my own son's engagement party. Then I felt a hand on my arm. My son my son Nolan, was beside me. He'd come through the crowd fast, like he'd been watching for exactly this moment. He got close enough that no one else could hear and said 3 words, "Dad, not yet." Just that. He looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was 7 and had already decided how something was going to go and just needed me to trust him. I didn't understand what he meant. I didn't ask. I stayed. My name is Howard Briggs. People who know me call me Howie, though I've been trying to retire that nickname since about 1987 with 0 success. I'm 62 and I live on a piece of land outside Cookeville, Tennessee, about halfway between Nashville and Knoxville, up in Putnam County where the Cumberland Plateau rolls out flat, and the mornings come in cold 8 months out of the year. I was born there. My father was born there. His mother was born in a house about 4 miles from the one I sleep in now. I spent 31 years as a licensed electrician. Started as an apprentice at 19, worked my way to master's license by 26, ran my own small outfit by 34. 3 guys, sometimes 4. Residential and light commercial. We wired new builds, rewired old farmhouses that hadn't been touched since the 60s, fixed the kind of problems that other people had made worse by guessing. I retired the business when I was 58, not because I was done, but because my body had its own opinions, and because the land needed attention that I'd been deferring for a decade. 14 acres. Modest by some measures, though I've never spent much time measuring against other people. A woodlot on the east side, a creek along the south property line, a garden that got a little larger every spring until it stopped being a garden and started being something I had to take seriously. I keep a few chickens. I had goats for a while. I'm not going back to goats. My wife, Deb, passed 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end of it. She was 54 years old and had more life in her on her worst day in that hospital than most people I've ever met at their best. I'm not going to linger here because I can't talk about Deb at length without losing the thread of this entirely. What I'll say is that she made me a better father than I had any right to be, and the kids know it, and we don't need to say it out loud anymore. We have 2 children. My daughter Rena is 33. She teaches special education at an elementary school in Murfreesboro, married a structural engineer named Tom, has twin boys who are 6 years old, and seem to be in a permanent competition to see who can cause more property damage in a calendar year. I love them immensely. And then there's Nolan, 31, an environmental attorney, which I still find slightly improbable given that until he was 14 he was absolutely certain he was going to play center field for the Cardinals. He graduated from Vanderbilt Law, clerked for a federal judge in Nashville, and now works for a firm that does environmental compliance and conservation easement work. Smart doesn't cover it. He thinks in a way I can't always follow, like the argument is already built in his head and what comes out of his mouth is just the summary. He and I got closer after Deb passed. He moved back to Cookeville for a year, not because he had to, but because he decided to. Drove out to the property most evenings. We'd work on whatever needed working on and then eat on the porch and talk until it got too dark to see each other. I didn't ask him to do any of that. He just did it. That's who he is. About 2 years ago he met someone. Her name was Shelby Mercer. Her family was from Franklin, Tennessee. Old money by Nashville standards, the kind that had been there long enough to become architectural. Her father, Douglas Mercer, ran a commercial real estate investment firm with holdings across Middle Tennessee and northern Alabama. Her mother, Lynette, did what wealthy women in Franklin do. Charity work, garden clubs, a seat on the board of a private school she hadn't attended herself. They had a house in Franklin that looked like a magazine concept, and a second property on a lake in Mississippi that they called the cabin, which required adjusting your definition of the word. Shelby herself was sharp and pretty, and said all the right things at the right moments. When Nolan brought her to the property the first time, she walked the garden with me and asked questions that sounded genuine. She noticed the woodlot and said she liked old-growth trees. She helped us set the table without being asked. I told myself I liked her. I think I was telling myself to like her, which is a different thing. There was a moment, maybe 20 minutes into that first visit, when she didn't know I was nearby. She was on the back porch looking at her phone, and Nolan had gone inside to get drinks, and I came around the side of the house from the garden. She looked up at me and there was something in her face for about half a second before she arranged it back into warmth. Just half a second. The eyes, Deb always said. Watch the eyes. The smile's the performance. The eyes are the rehearsal running late. I told myself I was being a suspicious old man. I kept telling myself that for about 18 months. The engagement party was Lynette Mercer's production. She'd organized it at a hotel in downtown Nashville, and she'd organized it the way she organized everything, with a thoroughness that left no room for anyone else's input. 70 guests. A private room off the main ballroom with lighting someone had clearly consulted about. Catering from a place that put the menu description in a font I needed reading glasses for. I was running late because my truck decided the morning of a major social event was the correct time to have an opinion about its battery. By the time I got there, ironed shirt, dress trousers, boots I'd cleaned twice. The room was already mostly full and the party was an hour underway. And that's when Shelby said what she said. Standing near the entrance with her sister Brooke and two of their friends, fixing her hair in the window's reflection, voice carrying just enough. Oh good, the repairman made it. Her sister caught herself, glanced at me, looked away. Brooke at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. Shelby never looked at me directly. That's what I keep coming back to. She never even checked to see if I'd heard. It didn't matter to her whether I had or hadn't. That's the part that sat the heaviest. Not the words, but the indifference underneath them. I turned toward the door. Nolan was there. Dad. Not yet. I looked at him. He held my gaze with a steadiness that didn't fit the occasion. Not the look of a nervous groom. Something older than that, something he'd been carrying for a while. I let him steer me toward a table near the back. I sat. I shook hands with the people he introduced me to. I ate food I couldn't tell you the name of and drank 2 glasses of something cold and talked to a retired contractor from Hendersonville who'd done commercial work in the same county I'd worked in for 20 years. Good man. Easy conversation. But every 15 minutes or so, across the room, Douglas Mercer would find my eyes and hold them for a beat too long. The look of a man confirming something he already knows. The kind of look that doesn't need words because the assessment is already complete. After most of the guests had cleared out, Nolan asked me to walk with him to the parking garage, his car. Doors closed, engine off. He sat for a moment with his hands on his knees. Then he said, I need to show you something. I need you to hear all of it before you say anything. He set his phone on the center console and pressed play. Shelby's voice, relaxed, comfortable in the way you are when you think no one is recording. The conservation easement is the piece Dad needs. Once it's in our name through the trust, the development corridor opens. Howie won't fight it. Nolan will convince him it's the right thing. He trusts Nolan completely. And a man's voice, Douglas, calm and strategic. Timeline, Shelby, 6 months post-wedding. Enough time for it to feel settled. I remember that the parking structure had a particular smell, exhaust and concrete and the ghost of somebody's fast food, and I focused on that for a moment because it gave me somewhere to put my attention while the ground was rearranging itself under me. The land she was talking about was mine. The 14 acres outside Cookeville. What most people didn't know, what the Mercers clearly did, was that Putnam County had been quietly working through an environmental review for a conservation corridor that would eventually connect 3 state-managed wildlife areas. My property sat directly in the path of one of the connecting segments. A conservation easement on my land, particularly one held through a private trust rather than a public land trust, could be leveraged against the corridor approval. The county would need to negotiate around it, or buy it out, or reroute at significant cost. Douglas Mercer had done enough commercial real estate in this region to know exactly what that leverage was worth. He had positioned his daughter to acquire it through marriage. He had been waiting with the patience of a man who thinks in quarters and fiscal years. There were more recordings. Nolan had been gathering them for nearly 2 months. He was methodical about it. He's a lawyer. He knew what he needed. He knew how to get it admissibly. He had conversations on his own phone that he'd been quietly flagging. He had a friend, a guy named Isaiah who did tech consulting, who had helped him pull metadata from documents Shelby had forwarded to him for review. The kind of forwarding that assumes your audience doesn't know what to look for. In those files were draft easement agreements, land valuations, correspondence between Douglas Mercer and a Nashville developer, and a list of county officials Douglas had apparently been cultivating for 3 years. My name appeared on signature lines on 3 documents I had never seen in my life. I looked at my hands for a while after that. These hands. The ones that had wired houses and pulled cable and carried a tool belt for 31 years. The ones that had planted most of what grows in that garden. The ones that had held Debs when she was going and couldn't hold much back. I finally said, "What do you want to do?" Nolan said. "I want to do it right, and I want to do it where they can't walk it back." Part of me resisted. That same part that's always resisted the public moment, the confrontation with an audience. My father's voice in the back of my head, handle it private, keep the mess inside the room. There's a dignity in that, I still believe. Not everything needs a stage. But then I thought about those signature lines. My name in someone else's handwriting, my land already parceled out in somebody's spreadsheet. And I thought about Deb, and something she said once when I was in the middle of swallowing something I shouldn't have swallowed. "Howie, quiet dignity is still dignity. But letting someone forge your name isn't quiet. That's just letting them win and calling it peace." I said, "Tell me the plan." Nolan had spent 2 weeks arranging it, which meant he'd been carrying this alone for all that time. Going to dinners with the Mercers and showing up to engagement planning meetings and smiling across the table at Shelby while knowing everything he knew. I don't know how he held it. I couldn't have. But he did. He'd coordinated with Isaiah on the audiovisual side. The ceremony venue, a restored event space in downtown Nashville, exposed brick and timber beams and the kind of natural light people pay extra for, had a projection wall at the front that was already in the layout for a photo display during the reception. The switch from photos to what Nolan had prepared was not something the Mercers had been consulted about. The morning of the wedding I put on my good suit, the navy one I bought for Rena's wedding 4 years ago and had dry cleaned twice since and never had occasion to wear again. I looked at myself in the hotel room mirror for a minute. Old face, white around the temples. Hands that'll never look smooth again regardless of what I do with them. I thought, Deb would think this was funny. She'd have been up at 5 organizing this. She'd have had a plan B and a plan C, and she'd have made me eat something before we left because she always knew I wouldn't eat when I was nervous. I ate something before I left. The ceremony was at 2 o'clock. The Mercer side of that room was a production in itself. Douglas in a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who've always had them. Lynette in champagne silk, moving through the space like she'd choreographed it herself, which she probably had. Their circle filled the right side of the room with a quiet confidence that comes from never having had to question whether you belonged somewhere. Nolan stood at the front of the room and looked like a man at peace. I was the only one there who knew what was under that. Shelby came down the aisle in a gown that probably had its own line item in somebody's tax return. She was beautiful, that's just true. She walked on her father's arm with her chin level and her smile measured for the cameras, and Douglas handed her to Nolan with an expression I've been trying to find the right word for ever since. Satisfied, maybe. The expression of a man who has moved a piece into position and is now waiting for the rest of the board to catch up. He sat beside Lynette. Lynette glanced across the room at me. I looked back at her and kept looking until she was the one who looked away. The officiant welcomed everyone. The room settled into ceremony quiet. Then, "Nolan Briggs, do you take Shelby Mercer?" Nolan raised one hand. "Before I answer," he said, and his voice was the same as it is when he's summing up an argument. Clear, level, no performance in it. "There are some things that everyone in this room has the right to know." The officiant stopped. Shelby's smile stopped. It didn't change to anything else yet. It just stopped, like a clock, and the wall lit up behind them. I want to describe this accurately, which means I have to go slowly. The room didn't understand all at once. First there was confusion, heads turning, people leaning together. Then Shelby's voice came through the room speakers, her real voice, the relaxed one. And then recognition moved across that room like a weather front, visible on every face in sequence as the sound reached them and settled. "Once it's in our name through the trust, the development corridor opens timeline. 6 months post-wedding. Enough time for it to feel settled." I wasn't watching the screen. I was watching the room. I already knew what was on the screen. I'd reviewed everything with Nolan the night before. What I hadn't previewed was this, the way 200 individual understandings of the world shifted simultaneously in one space. A woman in the 3rd row put her hand over her mouth. One of Nolan's law school friends, big guy, linebacker type, rose slowly from his seat and stood there like he wasn't sure whether to do something but felt the need to be upright. Lynette Mercer beside Douglas went the color of old paper. Douglas was on his feet before the second clip started. That's been altered. That's taken out of context. Nolan, shut that off. He was already moving toward the back of the room, toward Isaiah's station. The second clip ran. Douglas's own voice in his own office, in the unhurried tone of a man explaining a routine business operation. The corridor gets approved, that property quadruples. We need it controlled before the county's public notice goes out. Shelby manages the relationship. We manage the documentation. Something moved through the room then that wasn't a gasp and wasn't silence. It was heavier than both. 3 people on the Mercer side stood up. 2 of them moved toward the exit. Isaiah had anticipated Douglas coming for the booth. He had locked it before the ceremony started and gone to stand near the exit on the far side of the room. The presentation ran on its own. The third set of materials was documents, the draft easement agreements, the land valuations, the forged signature lines with my name on them, and the forensic analyst's report, prepared by a document examination specialist Nolan had retained 6 weeks prior, showing the signatures had been prepared by the same hand that appeared in correspondence found in the Mercer files. And then, because Nolan is thorough in ways that still catch me off guard, a fourth element. A brief video deposition from a woman in Memphis named Rosalind Tate, who had been briefly engaged to a business associate of Douglas Mercer's 7 years before. In her deposition, she described the same sequence of events: relationship, property asset, pressure to assign control through a trust mechanism, then rapid disengagement when she raised questions. She had not gone to the police at the time. She was going now. Douglas had reached the booth door, found it locked, and turned around. He was breathing hard through his nose. He looked at Nolan and for a moment something slipped in his expression. Not guilt exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a man who has calculated odds for so long that he can identify the moment he calculated wrong. A woman near the center aisle stood up and introduced herself without drama or preamble. She was maybe 50, simply dressed, unhurried. My name is Carol Fisk. I'm an assistant district attorney in Davidson County. I'm here today as a personal guest of the Mercer family. She looked directly at Douglas. Mercer, based on what I've witnessed here, I'm advising you and your wife and your daughter not to leave this building. I remember thinking that Deb would have had something to say about that moment, something dry and precise. I could almost hear it. Lynette Mercer began to cry. Quietly, the way people cry when they're not yet sure what they're crying about. Shelby at the front of the room had sunk slowly until she was sitting on the step below the altar. Her gown pooled around her, one hand pressed flat on the floor like she needed something solid. She wasn't performing. That part I'll say plainly, because it matters. What came off of her in that moment wasn't strategy. It was a person arriving suddenly at the far side of something they'd built and finding it had no floor. I'm not a hard man. I didn't want her demolished. But I thought about those signature lines, and I thought about what was supposed to happen to 14 acres that my grandfather broke his back to hold. And I stayed in my chair and let the room do what it was going to do. Police arrived within the hour. Douglas was escorted out, still negotiating, his voice having dropped into the register people use when they're trying to sound reasonable while the situation refuses to cooperate. Lynette followed behind him, sunglasses on in an indoor space, which she probably thought projected composure. Shelby walked between 2 officers with her head down and her veil crooked and the back of her gown dragging. And I think that detail, the gown dragging, is the one that stayed with me longest afterward. All that planning, all that precision, and in the end her dress was just catching on the floor of a room full of people who had stopped performing right along with her. Nolan found me near the back. We stood together for a minute without saying much. Then he said, "The catering is completely paid for." I looked around. Maybe half the guests had left. The other half were standing in uneven clusters, some talking quietly, some just present in the way you stay when you've witnessed something you're still processing. Rena had arrived. She'd gotten Nolan's text, driven over from Murfreesboro in just over an hour, and she came to me and put her arms around me in the middle of that room without saying anything. Her husband Tom stood nearby, hand on her shoulder. After a moment she leaned back and looked at my face. "Mom would have called this 40 minutes ago," she said. "She would have seen it coming from the first dinner." 40 minutes, I said. "Try the first handshake," she laughed. And then we both did quietly, in the middle of what remained of a wedding that wasn't, and it felt like the most honest moment I'd had in about 2 years. We ate. We actually ate. Nolan turned the music back on because the silence was worse. And gradually the people who'd stayed settled into something that wasn't a celebration, exactly, but was at least a gathering of people who knew each other, and had come through something together. One of Shelby's cousins, a young woman maybe 25, who'd been sitting on the Mercer side and had chosen not to leave, came to Nolan and told him she was sorry, that she hadn't known, that she thought something was off but hadn't let herself follow it far enough. He thanked her. He was gracious about it. That's who he is. Carol Fisk proceeded carefully, which is the correct way to proceed. Nolan provided every recording, every document, the full chain of acquisition. The forensic analysis held. The Rosalind Tate deposition opened threads that led to two other individuals with similar accounts, one in Chattanooga and one in northern Alabama, both involving property assets and trust mechanisms, and the same basic construction. Relationship as instrument, marriage as transfer mechanism. It was not improvised. It was practiced. That's what the evidence established. This was not a family that made opportunistic decisions. This was a family that had developed a method. The discovery process revealed what Nolan had suspected, but couldn't confirm until the financials were subpoenaed. The Mercer operation was in real trouble. The Franklin house, the lake cabin, the investment firm, all of it was structured debt at a ratio that wouldn't survive a single bad quarter. They needed liquid assets or leverageable ones, and they needed them faster than legitimate business was providing them. My property, in that conservation corridor, with the right easement documentation in a private trust, was worth multiples of its assessed value. But only if it was controlled before the county's public notice made the corridor common knowledge. They were not criminals who had stumbled into a scheme. They were people who had been operating at the edge of what they could sustain and had made a calculation about how far past that edge they were willing to go. I sat with that for a while. I won't claim it softened anything materially, but it changed the shape of it. There's a difference between cruelty and desperation dressed as cruelty, and I'm old enough to think that difference matters, even when the outcome doesn't change. Douglas Mercer, 14 years. Lynette, who her own defense team argued had been largely peripheral. The evidence mostly supported this, though not entirely. 6 years reduced on appeal to 4. Shelby, 11 years. The judge said something at sentencing that I've thought about often since. She said, "The premise of this fraud was that a man's life work is only worth what someone else decides to pay for it, and that his attachment to it is a vulnerability to be managed, rather than a value to be respected. That premise should have no place in this court and no place in this county." I wrote that down. It's on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, on a piece of paper I've replaced twice when it got water-stained. Nolan's back out here most weekends now. He started working remotely 2 days a week, which means he's on the property more than he's been since he was in law school. He's been helping me think through the easement situation properly. The right kind this time, a genuine conservation easement with the State Land Trust, which protects the property and gives me a tax benefit and ensures no one can do with it what the Mercers tried to do with it. It'll pass to him when I'm gone. He'll know what to do with it. He's seeing someone now. Her name is June. She's a hydrologist with the state, works on watershed management in the Upper Cumberland Basin. She showed up to Sunday dinner the first time in work clothes she hadn't changed out of because she'd been in the field until 4. And she said sorry about the mud on her boots, and Rena immediately liked her, and so did I. She asked me real questions about the property. The garden, the woodlot, the creek hydrology along the south line. She noticed where the water table was probably sitting based on the vegetation pattern near the fence row, and just mentioned it conversationally, the way you mention something when you find it genuinely interesting. She wasn't performing interest. She had it. We've had her back every Sunday since. Here is what I want to say before I let you go, and I want to say it plainly, without the kind of tidy bow that wraps up too easily. I almost walked out of that hotel lobby. That's the part I keep returning to. Not the trial, not the sentencing, not the moment the screen lit up in that ceremony hall. The lobby, one hand already turning toward the door. 62 years old and 8 words from a woman who'd decided I was furniture almost undid all of it. Almost sent me home. Almost meant Nolan did this alone. Almost meant the Mercers found a softer way to land and came back for the land eventually through some angle we hadn't thought to close. I didn't walk out because my son put his hand on my arm and asked me to stay. That's the whole of it. Not my courage, his ask, and my decision to trust it. There's a version of me who walks out that door. I've thought about him. He's not a coward. He's just a tired man who has had enough of rooms where he doesn't belong, and doesn't have anyone beside him pointing at a reason to stay. What Nolan understood, and what took me longer to understand, sitting in that truck in the parking structure listening to the recordings, is that the whole operation depended on me not knowing. It depended on me staying small and peripheral and assuming that what I felt in my gut was just an old man being paranoid. It depended on the lobby moment working, on me walking out. That's what that sentence was for. Not cruelty for its own sake. Removal. If I leave, I'm not a witness to anything. I don't see Nolan's face, I don't get the conversation in the truck, I don't know what I know. They needed me small and they needed me gone. And for about 4 seconds in that lobby they almost got both. I think about the people who've walked out. The Rosalind Tates who had something taken from them and never found the angle back in. I think about what it would take to be in that position. To know something was wrong, and to have walked out of the room before anyone put their hand on your arm and said not yet. If you have ever been in a room where you felt like you were being categorized before you could speak, where you felt the invisible inventory running across your work-worn hands and your ordinary clothes and your ordinary life, you know what that lobby felt like. You know how fast it moves, that decision. How physical it is. How much easier it is to turn and go. I am 62 years old. I have 14 acres with a creek that runs clear after a good rain and a woodlot I know tree by tree and a garden that's about 30% ambition and 70% stubbornness. I have a daughter whose sons are going to make me old faster than I'd planned. And a son who drives out most Sundays and sits on my porch until it's too dark to see across the yard. I wake up before light. I work until my back disagrees. I sleep like a man with nothing hidden. That is everything I was ever trying to build. That is all I ever wanted to leave. Now I want something from you. Leave me a comment right now and tell me. Type a 1 if you think Nolan was right. If you would have let the truth play out in front of everyone, right there in that ceremony hall, no matter what it cost. Type a 2 if you would have taken a different road. Maybe a quiet settlement, maybe a lawyer's letter, handled without an audience. And type a 3 if you would have done what part of me almost did. Walked out that lobby door the moment you heard it and never looked back. I'll read everyone. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Someone is going to see this at 2 in the morning, having just found out something about someone they trusted, and this is going to be the right story at exactly the right moment. That matters to me. It matters every single time. If something in this landed somewhere real for you, stay. I put these stories out as often as I can, and the next one is already waiting. Hit subscribe if you want to be there for it.